This is the Business Storytelling Show, a top global marketing podcast listened to in more than 100 countries, live streamed on social media, and broadcast on DBTV. Christoph Trappe chats with industry leaders to help your company tell better business stories. Here's today's episode.
Hey, business storytellers, how's everyone doing? Thanks for joining me. Today we want to talk about AI and how it's disrupting the online publishing industry. AI certainly has come on the scene in the last year. I think I just saw the thing from Christopher Penn earlier today, how ChatGPT just turned one. Maybe today, maybe it was yesterday, but pretty recent. Really quickly, I want to mention you can leave a review for the show on Podchaser, on Apple Podcast, on Spotify, and Amazon Music as well. Really appreciate Steve Miller leaving this comment from coming on the show. So really appreciate him. I like to know the stories from my guests, and that's why we create this content. Today's guest, Jon Gillham, he's the founder of Originality.AI. You can the URL is scrolling at the bottom here. You can also scan the QR code in the corner there if you prefer that kind of thing. But let's find out, what is AI? How is it disrupting the online publishing industry? And how do we make sure people are still creating unique content like what we're doing here right now? But of course, this is not written content. So let's get Jon out of the green room on the show and find out his take on the topic. Jon, nice to see you.
Likewise. Yeah, good times in the world of AI. 1 year old, it's phenomenal.
1 year old certainly feels a lot longer than that. But kind of give us an overview of Originality AI. What prompted the company? What's the goal, and what problem are you solving?
Yeah, so my background is in content marketing. That's what we were in before we launched Originality. We saw the challenge of generative AI coming even before sort of ChatGPT launched. Before ChatGPT, there were other tools like Jasper AI that you could use to create content. And then ultimately, we wanted to sort of help solve the problem of understanding if content was created by a human or if it was created by AI. We're not against AI content, but we want ultimately the person that's purchasing the content or the person that's publishing that content on their site to be the one that is making the decision on whether or not it's AI content or human generated content going on their site.
You know, what's interesting to me is I think a lot of people, when ChatGPT first came out, they just used it as that would be doing all the work, right? It's like, hey, write an article on whatever, write a podcast script on whatever. But if you do that, it's not really unique to my experience, right? But if I go to I don't actually use ChatGPT, but I like Claude AI. That's my go-to. Thanks again, Christopher Penn. But if I go in there and I say, um, I need a podcast outline for this episode with Jon, which we didn't script anything. So I'm totally made up example. And I say, Jon and I are going to talk about this topic, and here's the things we need to cover. What questions should I ask Jon? I mean, ultimately, I'm just using it as an enhancer and as a brainstorming tool, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that kind of setup, right? To use it to form your thoughts maybe a little bit better or get a draft, right? That's not the problem. The problem might be if you do it just from scratch and there's no input at all.
Yeah, and I think depends on who you are in terms of whether or not it's a problem. So, just recently, Sports Illustrated has gotten in a lot of trouble in sort of the public opinion because it's been shown that some of their content was generated by fake authors. Some of their product review content that existed on one sort of part of their site is actually created by a third party, but it was reviews about sports equipment, and it was shown that the authors were AI. And I think it's a question that sort of I'd say humanity is in general wrestling with on when do you want human contact and when is it okay, when are you happy to have AI contact because you don't care, you just want the answer. If it's like, what temperature do I need to, or how long do I need to cook this turkey for? American Thanksgiving just wrapped up. How long do I, and as long as that answer is right, you don't really care who that answer came from. Where should I go on a family vacation for kids that are interested in this activity? you probably want a human to respond with their personal experience, and so I think that's where I think society is still wrestling with understanding when we're okay with knowing that we have AI content and that's what we're consuming, and still wanting to make sure that we have sort of human content that we're consuming and thinking that it's a human that we're reading about.
The SI example was just fantastic, and Rick Riley just published an opinion piece. Of course, he was there for 23 years writing the back page opinion piece, and he wrote about how crappy he thought that was, and the issues with it, quite frankly. Um, but there is a place for, first of all, collaboration with AI, and the other thing, when you were just mentioning sports, I think I would have a problem with product reviews or product recommendations that are just a computer just spits them out. I mean, why do you need a recommendation at all? Just send me the product and I'll look at it, I guess. But AI also creates the little game stories in Game Changer, right? So
Yeah.
like the people, the parents put in the stats, and then Game Changer just puts a story together, and everybody thinks it's awesome. And we clearly all know it's AI, and nobody cares because, number one, nobody else would be writing that content to begin with. Number two, it's pretty good, right? Because it's just basically puts the stats into sentences. So there is a place for it. But at what point, how do people work with you, and who comes to you to make sure that they're checking content for originality?
Yeah, so fully agree. I think there's a phenomenal place for it. The majority of our users are web publishers, so companies like Sports Illustrated and similar. They're not, but like that, who have a sort of a team of writers that are producing content, and they've made the business decision that they don't want AI generated content on their site for either the reputation risk or the SEO risk associated with having AI content on their site without communicating and transparently sharing that this is AI content with their audience. Those are the people that use us to make sure that the content that they're publishing meets the sort of editorial standards that website publishing house. We work with some large publishers, that it meets the standards that they've set for their writers.
What's interesting to me too is I would like to dive a little bit more into how do you determine what's AI content and what's not. And this might be a new record, mentioning Christopher Penn 3 times in the first 9 minutes. But I think he was one of the people that said, a lot of times it's really hard to detect because the problem is bad writers. I think he used the term bad writers. Bad writers write very much like AI. So yes, it's written by a human, but they're not a good writer. Now, I assume most of your clients have good writers, so it's way easier to determine. But how do you actually know whether something
Yeah,
was written by AI or
yeah,
by
it's one of
just
the
not a very good writer?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, like I said, I disagree with Chris for Ben. I think AI produces really well written content. It certainly can. Does it create unique content that can really craft a narrative that is timely? No, there's limitations to it. I think it creates good content, doesn't create exceptional content. Um, so to answer the question, like how does originality work? How is it able to tell the difference between AI content and human content? So it's our own AI that's been trained. It's consumed, millions of records of human content and millions of records of AI generated content, and then it's able to identify patterns between the two. And what's kind of an interesting um, part of sort of how these systems work is that you can't necessarily say, well, because of it had 10 commas in this and therefore it got tagged as AI. The patterns that it's picking up on is what AI is really good at doing. It's hard, and it's what's hard for humans to do is sort of um, really complex pattern recognition. So that's how it works. It does have its limitations. We don't recommend it being used within academia, even though that's a common use case for the tool, because it doesn't create the same kind of um, hard proof of yes, this was AI generated. In all our tests, we're sort of 99% accurate on GPT-4 content and have like a 2.5% false positive rate, which we're working on getting down. It sounds low, but it's still way too high for really hard um, disciplinary action based on the results of an AI detector.
It's just very interesting to me how it works. And the other thing is, I have noticed when I'm playing around with AI content, there is a structure to how AI writes things, right? It's like they say it and then they repeat it and then they repeat it again. Like that's one thing I've noticed. I also think sometimes AI seems to use way more bulleted lists than I would ever use in my writing. So that sometimes is a telltale sign for me at least. I'm sure there's others. What is the role of? I know you guys do plagiarism checks too, and what's the role of that? I always find plagiarism interesting because sometimes I get flagged for plagiarism, but it's really just a common phrase. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yep.
everybody says it that way, and like there's only so many ways to say a certain thing. So how important is that in what you guys do?
Well, something that's fascinating right now that we're finding. So when we first built Originality, it was to create a sort of updated and modern plagiarism checker. That was sort of the main insight that we saw, that sort of large publishing, like you're pushing out sort of a hundred team that does 100 or 1,000 articles a month. Um, Existing plagiarism checkers just didn't have the functionality that was needed for that scale, and so that was kind of the initial insight. um, what we have seen is a massive drop off in the sort of in plagiarizing. And so um, and we've heard about this from within academia as well, that sort of, with the advent of generative AI being as effective as it is at producing content, the rate of plagiarism has massively dropped off, which is sort of something that, as it often does, it seems pretty obvious in hindsight, but certainly not, going back a year now, not what I predicted when sort of ChatGPT first launched. And then to sort of answer the question on, what is why are people concerned about plagiarism? And I think it comes down to that same, the same risks mitigation that people need to put in place, mitigating controls for the content that they're publishing to ensure that it meets their standards. Those standards are generally, we don't plagiarize, we don't copy from other people, and the risk associated with that is, or the consequence associated with that risk is both reputational damage, and the ability to rank that content to rank in Google is reduced if it's just been copied. And so that's what people are concerned about. And you're absolutely right that, there can be sort of snippets of text that are pretty common and pretty insignificant in terms of the risk to either one of those two concerns around reputation or rankings, if it's, a very common statement that is just being quoted in the article.
I mean, certainly, I'm a big believer in people creating unique content, original content, their own stories, and I still think that's actually the way to win. And I mean, B2B, B2C, I don't really care what people are in. So when sometimes, I think it was Todd Jones who was on the show, and he talked about we don't need any more top of the funnel content, and I totally disagree. Is unique, original content, right? So don't just everybody, uh, throw up the same kind of content, but tell your own stories. Um, how do you do you look at some of the stories that people share in the content? I mean, for example, I just wrote about lighted keyboards, earlier, and I say, well, here's how I use my lighted keyboard, and I like it because it's underneath my Veridesk, so it's pretty dark down there, if you think about it, and I'm telling my own story. So that's a telltale sign that that is actually original content because I'm talking about how I do it, right?
Yeah. So no, we don't read any of the content that comes through. But focusing on like the topic from an SEO standpoint and a ranking in Google, I mean, it's what Google has been sort of hammering home on over the last few updates, has been about that sort of exactly what you described, sort of the ability to um, have reviews shared by real people with real expertise, with real experience, in their reviews, or whatever the content is that they're producing, making sure that, the acronym of EEAT, but standing for like expertise, authority, and trust, trying to make sure that um, that Google is trying to sort of increase the amount that they index on that exactly describe that personal real experience.
Yeah, it's just a very interesting discussion. So how talk about your perfect clients, like who shows up and when you it was interesting when I was looking into how you describe what you do, web publishing and the publishing industry. I mean, that's like I'm a web publisher, right? Even my little blog is I'm a publisher, but are you talking about like traditional publishing companies or how does that typically look?
Yeah, so if you had a writer, so typically we were working with anyone that has a team of from team of 2 to 100 writers, and so that can be kind of a smaller or successful content website, or it can be a publishing house that's working with um, editors. Basically, we're building the tool set for copy editors, so anybody that receives text and then needs to make sure that text meets a certain sort of standard, not copied, not AI generated. That's where our tool kind of lands and best serves. That often looks like it's digital marketing companies that have writers working for them, and they want to make sure that they can tell their clients that these are human written, these aren't AI written. And because if it is AI written, then the question becomes, well, why did I spend, let's say it's $100, $500 for this article to be written? Why did I spend that amount of money for somebody to be able to produce it far more efficiently with generative AI? And who gets to kind of capture that value is an additional kind of interesting question.
I wonder, maybe this is not a conversation you guys have necessarily, but so I can just picture this. Like you have a writer and then, you flag the content as being written by AI. That's what your opinion is. And somebody goes back to the writer and says, well, this was written by AI and this it was not written by AI. I wrote it. I mean, how does that even what can the writer even say? I mean, or like, is that the final word? Do you know what I mean? How does that
Yeah.
conversation go?
Yeah, so we call those false positives. So where it's been incorrectly identified as AI, and the reality is it wasn't. It was human generated, and that it can cause pain. The typically there's some education around it, so the tool will return a probability on whether or not the content is AI generated or human generated. If it's 60% human, 40% AI, that doesn't mean that it thinks the article was 60% of the article was human and 40% was AI. It thinks with a 60% probability that that article is human written. And so if it's 60% human, 40% AI, it says I have 60% confidence that this was a human written article. And so that's if a human wrote that, then got it correct. That's not a false positive. And so that's often misinterpreted. Um, and then additionally, people can often similar to your example earlier, and the way that I use it myself is all sort of like, I like spreadsheets more than I like, text documents, and I'll write out whatever I intend to write out, but it won't be very, well thought out. Well, it won't be very well structured, and I'll just sort of like kind of puke my thoughts into ChatGPT, and then it will return a really sort of more structured document to communicate what I'm intending to communicate. And even though that's my own thoughts, my own writing, and I'm happy to share that. It actually gets identified as AI generated because AI was so involved in the creation of it. So sort of first step, if someone gets accused of AI, is to make sure that everyone is educated on what is and what isn't and how the score correctly works. And then additionally, we have a Chrome extension that allows people to visualize the creation of a document. And so this is what a lot of agencies and customers are using to try and help ensure that false positives don't become a problem in their organization, is that they have all of their writers working within a Google document, and then which we made free to make sure that sort of anyone, regardless of what sort of detector is being used, is able to make sure that writers are sort of being treated fairly. Is that it will visualize the creation of that document, and so it's almost like you can watch somebody write that document. No additional like spyware gets installed. This is just taking the metadata of behind the revision history on a Google document, and then creating a kind of a character by character recreation of how that document was generated. And so if someone does get sort of, hey, you have a false positive, like, hey, you created this with AI, and then you can show the entire creation process, then you have a good chance as the writer to communicate, no, this is actually a false positive. This is one of those kind of 2.5% of the cases where it got it wrong.
I'm just interested. I mean, how, now somebody's watching me write, and hopefully I'm not going to be judged by the software too much, how long it can take and how many breaks you take and
Yeah.
how many sentences at a time you write. But all joking aside, I know time flies. We got about 2.5 minutes left here. How do you stay up with the changes? I mean, all these tools, like they constantly update, right? Stuff changes and whatnot. How do you ensure to stay ahead of that?
Yeah. So a, we have a red what we ha- so we have a red team and the sort of the blue team is how we describe it. So we have a team that is constantly out trying to uh, trick originality, trying to come up with ways to bypass our own detector. And so that's one way that we stay on top of sort of adversarial approaches. And then additionally, every time a new model comes out, we have a testing regimen that we run every new tool through to understand um, if our detector is still effective and that effectiveness is. And then if it's not where we want it to be, then we build the data set and train our model on that new AI that has just been released.
I mean, it's just a ongoing process, certainly, to stay ahead of things and see what's going on and see what's happening. Really appreciate you coming on the show. And last minute here or so, tell us who should sign up with you. How do they sign up? What's the best process? And how does it work?
Yeah, so the best customers are anyone that is paying someone to generate content, and then we exist to help make sure that content meets specifications. So if that is a website owner that is buying content, if that is a small business that is working with a marketing agency that gets content created for your site, or if you have a team of writers that are producing content, that's our ideal customer. And the best way to use us is to go to Originality.AI, and there's a free version that you can use to try it out and then sign up.
At the end of the day, you're not going to hear any argument from me that people should create original and unique content. I think that's a differentiator in any content marketing strategy. So certainly, you got my vote on that. Jon, really nice to meet you. Thanks for joining me on the show. Episode 633 is in the books. And yeah, create unique content, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Okay. All right, thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks for tuning in. Please rate and review the Business Storytelling Show on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe so you don't miss